Well, thank you for joining us for this breakout session on Indigenous reconciliation and the Uluru Statement. I'll start with an acknowledgement of country, and I will recognise the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, which is the land on which we are here today, and also acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging of all the other countries where you all are joining us from today. So it's often said that peace begins at home. And for all of us, home is not just where we live, it is the whole country for us here in Australia. So how do we create peace with our Indigenous Australians who've lived here for over 60,000 years before European settlement? I'm Rob McGuirk from Rotary Melbourne, previous chair of its Indigenous Programs Committee and the current chair of the National R100 Entrachoma Project. Joining me today on our panel are Narita Raitt, who's a Yorta Yorta woman, who is a lawyer and the CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. Ian Ham, who's a Yorta Yorta man, who has extensive experience in senior roles both in government and the community sector with a focus on Indigenous issues. He's also a member of Rotary Melbourne. And Neville White, a biological anthropologist who has spent almost 40 years living and working with Yolngu people in North East Arnhem Land. Our panellists bring different perspectives to this topic, from the legal and regulatory aspects, government and business involvement, and views from remote Australia. So I welcome our panellists and thank you all for your participation in this session. Now, please feel free to post questions in the chat room for any of our panellists at any time, and we will consider these later in the session. So can I first ask each of you, what does reconciliation mean to you? And because of your diverse experiences, what do you think it means for the people you live and work with, that is your community? Narita, can I start with you?
Reconciliation for me means a variety of things. There's the institutional reconciliation, which is about ensuring that our institutions understand and value our culture, rights and experiences, that we can participate equally in those institutions, and that there is that historical acceptance and that ability to move forward. In terms of societal reconciliation, I think that the Invasion Day protests and the responses to Black Lives Matter show that we still have a long way to go in terms of society being in a position to understand our experiences, to understand the barriers that we face in undertaking the life activities that are just normal to them. And in terms of personal reconciliation, I think for me, coming from a family that has, on my mother's side, I'm obviously Aboriginal, but on my dad's side, that's a strong Irish Catholic family. And, you know, they didn't have any real exposure to Aboriginal people before my dad met my mum. But they began that process of understanding, and my nan was one of my fiercest advocates in school around teaching Aboriginal history and not being silent on it, about strongly identifying and participating in ad hoc week activities, participating in community events. So I feel like that personal reconciliation happened within my family, the two streams of my family, quite some time ago. And if I look at Matteo, my son, who's Italian, Aboriginal, Mauritius Indian, a bit of a licorice, all sorts. Through his experiences being a young Aboriginal boy, he's teaching his grandparents about that culture when they attend his Aboriginal daycare and kindergarten. And when they listen to me talk about what I'm doing and the barriers that my clients face and what I'm trying to advocate for, that means that journey is continuing for them. So it's ever evolving, I think, in all the different spheres. And personally, I've had more success than we obviously have societally, but I hope in the future that can even out a bit.
Great, thanks for that. Now, Ian, what about you in terms of you and the people you've been working with?
So thanks for that, Rob. I guess for me, reconciliation is a journey that we're yet to resolve, or actually, to be honest, resolve what the destination is going to be. I think one of the things we need to consider is where we're going with reconciliation is where we've been. So when we think about where Australia was 20 years ago, for example, in rough terms, 2000, where Australia was when I guess the reconciliation movement really took off, establishment of Reconciliation Australia and so forth, and we think about how far we've come. Certainly, I would say that the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australia is much better than it was. I think any objective assessment of that says that we have made great progress. But any objective assessment also says that there is still much work to be done. We have only come some of the way. The reconciliation journey, in terms of it being a personal one, I look at, I suppose, what I think of my place in the world. How do people regard me? How do people look at me? Think about me as an Aboriginal person? That too has changed over the past 20 years. But having said that, I still think there's a lot of, as I said before, there's still a lot of work to be done, a lot of work that needs to be done and that we need to focus on. And the question becomes, where do we want to be in a decade from now? What does reconciliation look like? And indeed, what does it look like in a generation from now? Again, in rough terms, 2040. What does a reconciled Australia look like? And it will be much more and much different when you think about the expanding agendas we have at the moment, including treaty, arguments for or propositions for First Peoples' voices to parliaments and constitutional recognitions. So I think reconciliation has started, if you like, the second part of its journey, which I think will be much more nuanced, complex and sophisticated than the first part.
Thanks, Ian. It's interesting you say that you feel now that you're fitting in better than it was 20 years ago. So you personally feel like you're fitting better into society now? Or?
I don't know if I fit better into society, but I think I understand society better than I used to. One of the things with reconciliation is it's often about non-Aboriginal people understanding Aboriginal people. I like to think of it the other way. You white fellas, you're a weird mob. I'm still trying to work you out. So for reconciliation is a two-way street. So for me, it's more about how do I thrive in the non-Aboriginal world in which I live. I like to think I'm doing an okay job of it. Depends on who you ask, I guess. But I think it is that two-way thing where Aboriginal people, we're moving from beyond, reconciliation is helping us, among other things, but helping us move beyond the notion of surviving to the notion of sustainability or being a sustainable community to indeed thriving. That's really how I like to think of my community, but also myself. I've gone beyond that bit of having to justify who I am and how I identify to now it's just generally accepted. Ian Ham, Yorta Yorta man, here's his background, and people are quite comfortable with the notion. As for me, as I said, for me it's about a journey, finding out more about the society I live in, we all live in, and where do we want to take it.
Thanks, Ian. Neville, getting back to you about what does it mean to you, and because of your experience in remote Australia, what do you think it means to the people in the community you've been involved with?
Yeah, it's a fundamentally important question. I think it's a question that should be addressed to people Australian-wide, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, as to what they understand by reconciliation or what it means to them. Because Reconciliation Council, for example, defines reconciliation as strengthening the relationship between Aboriginal, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people for the benefit of all Australians, where other definitions, one I came across, the words are far stronger, saying it's a need to overcome the legacy of colonisation and dispossession and help raise many Aboriginal people out of poverty. Now, I put this question very recently to people I work with in the remote community in northeast Arnhem Land. The first thing was that for the only literate individual in the homeland, the remote community, when I put the question, what does reconciliation mean to you? I say she's the only literate person, she's a teacher, she didn't know what reconciliation means. I put to her, what does she understand by the Uluru Statement? She'd not heard of it. I spoke to other community members and the same thing. Obviously, this discussion hasn't gone beyond probably the edges of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia, but the most interesting definition came from Damien Bungun Goyla, who was the the narrator in the film some of you have seen, the Homeland Story, when I put it to him recently, he said that reconciliation for him means people respect his culture and give them a fair go. I think it's a really nice, concise statement. And in that, there's a need to overcome racism, which is his final statement. So you see there's a suite of understanding with various depths and colour. But I think Damien's definition that he's applying to his own group in a remote community is a very telling one.
Thanks, Neville. Ian, you were just talking before about the improvements you've made that you've seen in your time. Narita, if I turn to you as well to say, if you could achieve reconciliation, what do you think our society would look like in 10 years' time?
I think that in 10 years' time, if reconciliation has occurred, which I think is overly ambitious, not only will society have gone through a process of truth-telling, from understanding our issues of inequality, systemic racism in instances where our people have been ignored, denied or reduced, but they also would have put the resulting recommendations into action, and we would have seen concrete movements by both state and federal governments towards addressing those barriers, towards addressing those inequalities by making sure that our society works for all and not just for some. I also think that we'll find that if we're achieving reconciliation for Aboriginal people and wider Australian society, we also should hopefully see a greater acceptance of multiculturalism. Hopefully that would then extend into refugees and the like, and we'll have a society that's based on equality rather than otherism.
Thanks, Narita. And part of that, it's been mentioned as well about the importance of treaties and recognising the past and the way that the Indigenous people have been treated. Recently, we've formed in Victoria the First Peoples Assembly there to negotiate with the Victorian government. And why do we need treaties, and how important are they for reconciliation in your view?
I think. Look, treaties are not so much just about importance for Aboriginal people. I think that it's an important for the whole of Australia and every citizen of Australia. So it's not just from an Aboriginal perspective, it's important. There is unresolved business in this country that dates back to the beginning of colonisation. And anybody who says it doesn't is either incredibly ignorant of Australian history or just doesn't want to get engaged and has something, they've got their own agenda they want to push. First part of that is the treaty process will enable, I guess, dealing with the outstanding issues, the unresolved issues of how does Australia move forward in regard of there was dispossession of people. We've got to resolve that. There has been an alienation of the First Peoples within our own country. How do we deal with that? How do we find a set of arrangements so we can move forward? How do we find a set of arrangements which finds a proper place for Aboriginal people within the overall context of Australia? That should be the subject matter of a treaty. And by that I mean taking the term self-determination and giving it daily actuality. What are the power structures? What are the authorising structures or the inputting structures of Aboriginal people into national life, for example, or into the life of their state, for example? That's really important. And it's not just about the rights of Aboriginal people and the exposition or the exercising of those rights. It's also about Aboriginal people making a contribution to the wider society. To put it most bluntly, I actually think that Aboriginal community and the way we function and our social structures work, that actually has lessons for the broader Australian population. Because one of the things that I guess distressed me, particularly over the past 12 months, was seeing the individualism of Australia has come out, but in a bad way. The most successful community at managing COVID, the Aboriginal community nationally. I think there's some lessons in that can be applied to a whole range of lives or a whole range of circumstances in Australian life that the treaty process may open up and allow to happen. That for me is an important reason why treaties should happen, not just to deal with the issues of the past. If it's that, then it's not really a treaty process, but it should be about the arrangements we have for the future to allow the contribution of Aboriginal people to Australia or to a state to realise its maximum potential. That's what a treaty should be about. That's why it's important to me, important to us, and also should be important to every Australian.
It's interesting you mentioned the fact that the COVID experience was mentioned by Marsha Lincoln, I think, recently in the press to say that she thought that was a great example of listening and working with Indigenous people and getting a better outcome because it has much less infection rates than anywhere else in the country. So that was one example of a great success, listening and working together with government and Indigenous voices. One of the keys to the future, of course, is education and creating equal opportunities for all Australians. Neville, if I can turn to you, because how can we improve this for remote Indigenous Australians as we can't provide all the facilities available in the cities for those areas? How can we manage that, do you think, for remote Indigenous Australians?
Just in the preamble to answering that, Rob, getting back to the issue of treaty, I think what needs to be understood is that in fact that 80% of Indigenous Australians live in the cities and regional areas. 20% live in remote and very remote areas. And I think a treaty, the point's been made by a number of scholars and Indigenous people, would probably need a number of treaties because the problems and aspirations of remote people do not necessarily gel with those in the urban centres. And that's been put that perhaps there should be individual treaties drawn up with local landowning groups, and perhaps the wording that comes from those individual ones could be drawn into a national treaty. But I think there certainly needs to be recognition of the differences within the Indigenous populations of Australia. As for the question of education, it takes us back to the equity and access to the resources that are available to every other Australian, but not available to the people I work with. Why should children be queuing up to try to wait for a teacher to come to their school to teach them? Why are we having to raise money through the Rotary Club and others to bring part-time teachers and teach 20 or 21 children? This needs to change, where the remote Aboriginal communities that I'm talking about have equal access to these services, and requirements for a decent and productive life are available to them.
Thanks, Neville. On the question of treaty that's been raised again, you raised a good point about this in very many different nations. So how does that work? Do we need to have a separate one with each nation, or is there something we can do on a national basis? And Rita, have you got any thoughts on that?
Look, treaty, as it's commonly understood, is an agreement between states, nations and governments. Now, this can be a collective of agreements. Small treaties between different nations and local government, between a collective of nations and state government, or between the vast, diverse collection of Aboriginal communities and tribes with the federal government. Now, there's not a one system fits all here. It isn't that you just print out a template off the internet and off you go. The form and content and structure of a treaty is supposed to be dependent upon the history between those parties, what they're trying to actually achieve, both in a political context, in a social context, as well as in an institutional context. And we're seeing this kind of process play out at the moment in the state of Victoria, where they're undergoing a process of treaty that is a treaty between all of the tribes of Victoria and the state government, just the one. At the moment, there isn't any talk of doing local state-based ones. Now that, we can't preempt it because those discussions are just starting, but it is a really good opportunity to recognise and celebrate our status, our rights, our culture and histories that have largely been ignored. I can't think back to a period, either in my primary or secondary or even higher education, where Aboriginal history was openly spoken about and embraced, that our rights were talked about. We usually push to the very end for like half an hour, and then that's the end of it. So it's a really great opportunity to kind of change that narrative, change that focus, but also address it in terms of a treaty. We're making sure that we're setting out something that actually works. And that's the importance of looking at local agreements as well, is that every community, their differences are stark. The experience of an Aboriginal person in Mildura is very different to the experience of an Aboriginal person living in metropolitan Melbourne. Not only is that in the justice system, in education, but it's also in everyday life. Melbourne as a city is very culturally diverse and multicultural, and in fact more embracing a difference. But in Mildura and places like Shepparton as well, there's huge stark differences where society is kind of broken down into the haves and the have-nots, which is largely divided on race. So I think it's important to keep in mind what we would like to achieve in treaty for those smaller groups as well, and making sure that we do come back to local agreements so that they can have a chance at having being equal in their own local place, rather than just a very empty promise of something happening in the future, which I feel is the history of Aboriginal affairs. In terms of the national process, I do have great hope that as part of the recognition of past wrongs, we will see an acknowledgement of Aboriginal Victorians that enhance existing laws and build upon them in a way that addresses their systemic racism and mitigates that there will be the opportunity for official apologies and truth-telling, and that there will be actually the transfer of decision-making power and resources so that our people can make decisions about the matters that affect us, which history and experience has told us is the best way forward.
We hear a lot of talk, and some people will be familiar with reconciliation action plans and how they work and what they're involved with. Are they still important? What role do they play in this process? And should every organisation have one? Then you've got a lot of exposure in this area, I think.
Yeah, so I've done a bit of work with various bodies doing reconciliation action plans. I think they're a useful tool, or they have been a useful tool. So, and when you think about when they really started to be implemented, which was around 15 years ago, maybe longer than that, they were an extraordinarily useful tool at the time. They got people focused on what people could do around driving reconciliation, particularly within corporations or big organisations, be they government agencies, private sector, not-for-profits, whatever it is. I think, though, they have probably in their original form almost reached their use-by date to an extent. That's not to say they're not useful for those starting out on the reconciliation journey. But when it reaches the point where it's just a continuance of what you've already done, you have to ask the question, have they really continued to deliver what they were originally set out to do? So reconciliation action plans were not about identifying a series of actions that you could tick off and saying, we have done that. What they were and what they are is simply a tool for a greater outcome. The greater outcome being that, for example, in your organisation, the people who work for you have a deeper and better understanding of Australia's first people, of Aboriginal communities, particularly the ones they live in and the ones they work with. That was the purpose of reconciliation action plans. I think what's happened, though, is that people have interpreted actions under the plans as the end goal of reconciliation, and it's not. The question that is then begged because of that proposition is, well, then where do we go from here? What do we do? And I think that really gets to the nub of the question, have reconciliation action plans, to the extent that they exist now, have they fundamentally changed the DNA of the organisations who use them? Now, two high-profile organisations, Rio Tinto and Australia Post, have been on Elevate RAPs, which is the highest level of RAPs for some years now. Now, Rio Tinto didn't let the RAPs and their commitment to Aboriginal communities stand in the way of their prime purpose, which was mining, the caves in Western Australia. I don't think I need to say anything more about that. Australia Post willingly and put their hand up and said, we need to take a whack and lose our Elevate status because of the behaviour of some of our staff, sales staff, in remote communities and what they did in terms of selling incredibly bad products for remote community people. They stuck their hand up to take it. So I think that shows that, and both the CEO, Rio Tinto, has really caught to the, really understood that despite their Elevate RAP status, had the fundamental DNA of their organisation changed, had Aboriginality and respect for Aboriginal people and understanding the circumstances of Aboriginal people and what is important to us, had that been spliced into the DNA of the organisation? And the answer was no. So I think we have to look at where do we go with reconciliation in terms of reconciliation action plans and their capacity to change organisations. What's the next iteration? What's the next generation? Are RAPs as they are the right way to go in the future, or do we need something else, something that's different? At the end of the day, Reconciliation Australia will tell you that RAPs are simply a tool to get to a greater end. That is a better harmonised or a better reconciled Australia. And if you've got a better one than the RAPs, they'll happily support you with that. So I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves about what does RAPs of the future look like in terms of achieving the outcome we want.
Thanks, Ian. Neville, because you've spent obviously a lot of time in the remote areas, what do you think things like this mean to Indigenous remote communities? Are they seeing any change in attitudes that you noticed from corporations that are involved with remote communities?
Well, first, it's interesting to hear Ian say how useful, like early on, that RAFs have been, reconciliation action plans have been for many people. But these are in the large centres. They're certainly not particularly useful for people in the regions and certainly not in the remote communities. So to have opportunity for access to organisations, institutions, is a good thing. But again, the remote communities, it's absolutely has no value or understanding whatsoever. The question of what needs to improve with remote communities is for better communication, understanding and willingness for people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to go and listen to people, respect their aspirations, to work with them to actually to achieve what they want. What happens now is that there are many visitors who come in and write papers and go away, but they don't follow up on either their promises or the words that were given to them to act upon. So the Aboriginal people themselves in the remote communities get nothing from the sorts of interactions that may be available to people in the larger centres.
Yeah, I must admit it is difficult to understand what the remote communities are like until you actually go there, and it's been interesting. Fortunately, I've been able to travel a couple of times out there with you. And again, the film that made Homeland Story, I think, is one way we can get people to understand a bit what the issues are in remote communities. So I suppose that sort of work is one way to get it, because otherwise it's difficult, I suppose, for the people in the city to connect with remote Australia.
Rob, if I might add to that, and picking up what Neville said and just draw it out a bit, the notion that Aboriginal Australia exists is actually a contestable one. There is no single Aboriginal Australia. We are a diversity of people, our own nations, our own experiences across the length and breadth of Australia. We have some things in common, particularly experience over the past 200 years. But where we are and where we exist and the circumstances we find ourselves in are significantly different. One of the problems that I think people approach reconciliation with is they take the universal approach as a singular thing to Aboriginal Australia, and it just doesn't work. What works in suburban Melbourne is, and I think it's a safe bet when I say this, it's not going to work in remote Arnhem Land, or it's not going to work in Hermansburg. You have to have an entirely different starting point if you're going to work out a set of arrangements that allows the community to reach its optimal, which is fundamentally what reconciliation is about. And Neville's right. In some parts, the word reconciliation means nothing. The notions of treaty and voices to government mean nothing, because all the local people want is just to be heard. They just want to have a bit of a say in what goes on in the place they live. Without realising it, that's exactly the same aims. But we have to remember, we have to apply reconciliation and think about it in the circumstances that people live, and not expect people to fit in a one-size-fits-all. That, for goodness sakes, has been the problem with policy around Aboriginal affairs for, past 150 years.
And the history of treaty as well, because in New Zealand they've already arranged a treaty, but of course it's a little bit simpler when they've got not so many diverse nations we have here in Australia. So that's a nice segue into talking about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So in 2017, this was the first such collective expression by our First Nations people of the next steps required to take us forward on the road to reconciliation. So the Statement from the Heart refers to a voice. So what is the voice, and how should that voice be heard?
The proposal to Indigenous voice would provide a way for Indigenous Australians to provide advice and input on matters that are important to improve their lives. There's talk of two parts, a local and regional voice, a national voice. A national body made up of Aboriginal and Islander people that could provide advice to Parliament and government on relevant laws, policies and programs, could engage early on in the process. And then a regional level governance structure that would be designed and led by communities, provide advice to all government about what's important in communities in the region, and work in partnership with government to make plans on how to meet community aspirations and provide local views for national voice. One of the things that is constantly discussed in this debate within the circles that I operate in is that any Indigenous voice, in order to be influential, needs to be enshrined. And that discussion is about trying to have some certainty, because we haven't had much of that in the last 200 odd years. Also talking to having an ability to speak truth to power, to be really clear about what is needed both at a national and a regional level, but provide advice that is based on facts and evidence and is not based on the political will aspirations of a local parliamentarian. That is what keeps coming up time and time again. And when you talk to people who are in prison, or if you talk to young people who are experiencing child protection and residential care, they'll tell you that the only way to be listened to is to have some sort of power to be listened to. That's the only thing that matters. So for me, if we're talking about Indigenous voice, I want to make sure that there is that independence, there is that guarantee, and there is that element of power, because I fear what will happen if there isn't.
Ben, what about your thoughts in relation to
that? In relation to the voice to Parliament?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, look, I agree with Narita. There has to be the confidence that the legitimacy of that voice won't be contested or torn down. It's one of the problems with a legislated approach is if a government can have the best intentions, it can set up a great structure, it can be legislatively sound, change a government, it can just abolish the whole lot. We saw it, imperfect as it was, we saw that with ATSIC. We have the first People's Assembly here in Victoria. I'm hoping Victoria stays true to its social reform that it's always had, regardless of who's been in power, and the first People's Assembly continues regardless of who's in government. But Narita's right. Unless you have that so solidly, the foundation of it is so solid that no government of the future can tear it down, and that is through a constitutional mechanism. The ability to exercise exercise your voice to make it heard with the confidence that there'll be no repercussion for it is actually really important. I would think that until that's done, we'll still be in this place of unsurety about where Aboriginal people or how we get to exercise our voice. And a lot of our voice will be still have to be devoted to arguing the principle that we should have a voice in the first place and how it should play out. That's why the Uluru Statement was really about not what we want to say, but ensuring we have the mechanisms to be able to say it and the confidence and surety that those mechanisms will stay in place beyond, as Narita put it, and she's quite right, the short-termism of modern politics as opposed to the long-term game of substantive policy.
So there's currently two schools of thought then, whether constitutional reform should be the first step or legislative reform. So I guess from that you're suggesting you go the constitutional route first?
Oh, look, I would, in an ideal world, sure, constitutional reform would be first. I've been around long enough to know that if you wait for the ideal, perfection is the enemy of getting anything done. That's just a fact. So if as a first step we had to accept a legislative approach, that doesn't mean you give up the fight or the argument for constitutional recognition. You just simply use it as a stepping stone to a greater outcome. If you say we're not going to play until we get exactly what we want, I believe that's called holding your breath, and the only person you hurt is yourself when you do that. I may have a great nephew who does that from time to time. He's 3 years old, holds his breath sometimes till he gets what he wants, and he often finds he doesn't get perfection. He'll get a compromise and you move on from there. Same is true of what we're trying to achieve here. So I would, sure, look, the pragmatist in me says, yes, legislative arrangements get us going, but is by no means the end, nor is the final acceptance. You keep arguing for what you want as the ideal, and hopefully you get there ultimately.
But I think we also need to understand that constitutional reform is incredibly hard to achieve. It is very rare for constitutional amendments to get up because of the way that the votes that you require and the majorities. And it's really important to remember the last constitutional reform was 1967 when Aboriginal people were recognised. And unfortunately, by that time, my mum was 5. My grandmother had already passed away. So I think we, like Uncle Ian said, need to be really pragmatic about saying there might be a first step, which might be legislative change, and then the second step will be constitutional enshrinement of that voice. I think that's a pragmatic way to go. But I think at each stage we need to make sure that we are staying true to the intention and aims of what community is saying will work, and we're doing something that will last long term, not something that'll be for the first 3 years or 4 years, or something just to put out on a document to say, hey, we did something. That's really important to remember.
I think that's probably right, because there was immediately after statement from the Harbour was released, it was roundly dismissed by the government as being the third chamber of Parliament, which really did destroy some of the debate, unfortunately. So
it gives you an indication of their attitude towards Aboriginal Australia, that it is. I feel that they felt that statement was a threat to the power balance that they felt they had established. In my view, there never has been a power balance. There's been a very distinct power imbalance, and that statement was trying to address that. I do hope that perhaps with some reflection and some enlightenment, federal government might rethink, reevaluate, and come up with sensible policies and positions, but that's not always guaranteed.
Degree, I think, essential that the voice be enshrined in the Constitution. A concern that I have is the fact we should be using voices, but whose voice will be heard? I know that the Regent said that the plan is to have local and regional voices before this is brought together for a national one. But is there not a danger that if you like, electoral numbers will diminish the voices of those people who don't have the political sophistication or clout?
I guess there is always that danger, Neville, but I suppose I look at our federal parliament and think, yeah, I get the argument you're making there. I suppose for me, what the detail of this looks like and how you make it work shouldn't prevent us from exploring it, shouldn't prevent us from pushing it. I think one of the things that's often happened in Aboriginal affairs is too often people have gone, yes, but what if it goes bad? That's the kind of thinking which for me has, and sometimes this happens within the Aboriginal community too, people are afraid of a change to the status quo, or because we don't know the detail of everything, therefore we shouldn't do it. That's not really how we're going to find a way forward. So my first step would be let's we commit to wanting to have a voice, but you're absolutely right, Neville. We have to give balance and proportion to it so that the rights of Indigenous people, as I said before, we're a diverse population across this country. How do we give balance and voice to that diversity? It would be an intriguing political model to come up with. I have to admit it. Now you've probably got me thinking about that for the whole weekend. I'll think about that. But you're right. We have to find those models which give equity to people's voice, from the urban areas of Sydney and Melbourne to remote communities.
But if there's anybody who can do it, it's going to be Aboriginal Australia, because the way that we operate, which you saw through the COVID pandemic and this throughout our history, we can a collective basis. We don't act in individual rights. We don't consider the individual. We always consider the collective. It is all about how can we make sure that all communities have equal voice and equal say and have equal access. And certainly through these debates around the Indigenous voice and how that would work, that has been kept to heart by the Indigenous participants at all stages. So I'm kind of aspirational that we can achieve it if we put our mind to it.
Thanks, Narita. Well, get your questions in. If there's any questions for the panel, please get them in now. And just a last one then to wrap up then. For the people who are out there listening to us today, just a few thoughts on what you think they can do in terms of moving this reconciliation process forward. That's both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Maybe Narita, start with you.
Well, just reflecting that from the date that we're recording this, the 30th anniversary of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which was established in response to a growing public concern that death in custody of Aboriginal people were too common and public explanations were too evasive to discount the possibility that foul play was a factor in many of them. And in 1991, your national Indigenous incarceration rate was in the low teens. Now it's 29%. That tells me there is a long way to go. That tells me that 30 years on from providing a blueprint, and the Royal Commission just wasn't about justice issues. It talked to institutions. It talked to systemic racism. It talked to the need for accountability and transparency. What we've seen from successive generations of politicians is basically the same old, same old. There's nothing new. There's been no meaningful implementation. Subsequent reports like the Pathways to Justice and other pivotal reports around Aboriginal Australians have gone unnoticed. They're in the dust pile. They're not being addressed. So certainly I think that our role as a civil society is to bring government to account, to be that voice of truth, to use our voting power, to be really clear about what our expectations are of them. That we don't want to live in a society that just works for some. We want to live in a society that works for all. We don't want to be locking children up who are 10 years of age. We don't want to start that incarceration cycle that early. We don't want to be locking victims of family violence up for cycles of imprisonment that are short and sharp, but effectively remove them from their housing, from their children. We want to address those issues in the system. We want to address the racism. We want to address the inequality. That's what I would like to see, and hopefully within my lifetime, because I was 3 years old when this was released, and I can't see much progress. Rather, I think we've gone backwards, and I don't know if that's apathy or racism or just putting everything in the too hard basket, but I hope that can change.
Thanks, Narita. Neville, any thoughts about what people who are listening to the session today can do to help take reconciliation forward?
Yes, I do have thoughts. I think that again, for the groups I'm familiar with, the key is a recognition of traditional land ownership, not just rights, traditional land ownership, not just the spiritual connection, but also the economic importance of land. And on that land, the opportunities for education and vocational training. Because I don't want to see, as I've been experiencing over many years now and recently, people who have taken off to prison who in fact say to me they'd want to go or they should go to prison because they can't afford to pay their fines. They come out up to me with their hands together, with the handcuffs, saying it's best for me to go to prison because I can't afford to pay the fines on my welfare payments for driving without a licence, for trying to get to a store to get food for my community. I had no access to it, so I borrowed a vehicle. And they've got fines they can never pay off. And in desperation, there's despair among those people saying we cannot deal with it and it's easier if we go to jail. And I think that's the tragedy.
Thanks, Neville. Ian, your thoughts, last thoughts on what we can do out there?
I suppose for me, it's really people thinking about what can I as an individual do, and then collectively, what can we do? So first thing I would say is probably rethink about how you conceptualise us as a people. Okay, so that's the first thing. Too often people think of us as a series of problems that need to be fixed, whether it's in urban communities or remote communities, whether it's older people or young Aboriginal people. We're defined by disadvantage. We're defined by deficit. That's wrong. That is just not who we are. What people should do, first of all, is reconceive how you think of us. We're actually a people of unrealised opportunity and unfulfilled possibility. That's the first thing we are. We are not a series of unresolvable, or as they call it now, wicked problems to be dealt with. The second thing, I suppose, is before taking action, take stock. And what I mean by taking stock is look at the landscape, understand who you want to work with and why you want to work with them. First, a question I ask a lot of people when they say, I want to do something for Aboriginal people, the question I ask is why? Why do you want to do this? I want to help Aboriginal people. Get past that. Why do you want to do it? So that second question is take stock of why do I want to do this? And the third and most important, ask the Aboriginal community what's important to it. Too often I've seen people come forward with ideas that they want the community to fit into, rather than ask the community what's important to it and what it wants to work on. And if that doesn't fit your idea, then change your idea or take your idea somewhere else where it does fit. So I suppose for me, that's what people can walk away with. In terms of Rotary clubs, wanting to do projects or wanting to do activities with Aboriginal communities, remember, this isn't about your Rotary club. This is about the Aboriginal community you want to work with. And as a service club or service clubs, our role is to serve. So let's see what the service that is wanted by the communities we want to work with, rather than what services we have to offer them, whether it's of any use to them or not. They're probably the three big takeaways I would give people.
Thanks, Ian. I think, that gives us a great summary and something to move on from. So I'd like to thank all the panels for today. And that's the end of the session, I guess, because we're going to move into Q&As.